have you here on this Tuesday evening. Really excited about this event. This is, we do a lot of events, but there's always those ones you kind of put on the Mount Rushmore of your mind and you're really excited about it happening. And this has certainly been one I've been looking forward to the past weeks and months. We have been doing variations on virtual events now for 2+ years. And it's been a great way to stay tethered with you guys, our audience, but also really to reach a lot of new people. I know there's a lot of people watching tonight who are outside of our area, outside of Tulsa, outside of Oklahoma, probably outside of our region even. So thank you for tuning in tonight. I won't give you the whole spiel about Magic City Books, but I will tell you that we are a nonprofit bookstore here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We are located in what was the historic Greenwood district, about 2 blocks away from Greenwood. And we are a general bookstore. I hope you guys get a chance to visit someday and see what we have to offer. But we do about 100+ author events a year. And we're starting to kind of work our way back to doing some in-person things. So stay tuned for that. If you're in our area, you can go to our website, magiccitybooks.com, and see what's coming. We're kind of about a 50-50 in-person virtual thing. We're going to try to get that to like an 80-20 by the end of the year. But also it's a wonderful way to still reach people and have conversations that we might not be able to have otherwise. So I anticipate that we'll always probably have some kind of virtual component to our program offerings in the future. So thanks for that. We had the great pleasure of doing an event when the Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois first came out, and also the great privilege of having and claiming Honorée Fanonne Jeffers as an Oklahoman. Obviously she's not from Oklahoma, but she lives down the road, so we're claiming her a little bit. If you haven't read the Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois, you certainly need to put that on your to-do list. Maybe call in sick to work tomorrow, whatever it takes. And I don't know how you wouldn't have heard about the book. It's been an Oprah Book Club selection, most recently and so excitingly, just won the National Book Critics Circle Award for fiction, which we won't embarrass her, but I think it's one of many awards still to come for this book. But when we had an inkling that Honorée might be joining us tonight for this conversation, it was a true treat. So first, thank you, Honorée, for joining us. I will say Honorée was recently added as one of our advisory board members for Magic City Books too. So really love having her involved with what we're doing here. Tonight, though, is a real celebration of a book that kind of knocked my socks off. I've been aware of and reading work by Maude Newton for a long time. And I think any of us who have followed her work have been like, what's the book gonna be? I think we've been kind of like wondering and waiting. And I think it was interesting because when I first heard that the book was coming, it was one of those things where I was so intrigued and I didn't know what this book was going to be. I was like, what is this book? And then when you start reading it, you kind of want to define things in your mind. So you start going, am I reading a memoir? Am I reading a work of history? And it's all those things. It's also like a detective work in a certain sense. It kind of blends all these different disciplines and strategies together to look at a life and look at a family and look at generational trauma. And this book, of course, is called Ancestor Trouble, and I think is going to be one of the most talked about books of this year. And we're going to get into why quite soon. So thank all of you for joining us and watching. I know a lot of people are watching live on Facebook as well. So let's just kind of dive into this. First, I will say, welcome Maude, welcome Honorée. Let's have a great conversation. Thank you both for joining.
Thank you for having us, Jeff. This is just so exciting. I am so blown away by Maude's book. I loved it. I blurbed it. I just sort of do ruthless promotion to the point of being obnoxious about it, sort of right up to the edge of being obnoxious, because I just think this book is just fantastic. And I think it's doing a lot about the story of America.
So one thing, it's interesting is, so we have a work of nonfiction we're looking at tonight. We have a work of fiction. I think one thing I'd like to start with is kind of finding some of the connective tissue between what both of you were doing. To me up front, and I will say this, anyone who's watching, this is an open conversation. We want your questions to be pouring in. So please, as you hear what we're talking about, throw those questions into the Q&A and I'll be pulling some of those while we go. So just feel free to start plugging away at those. But this concept of generational trauma is something that kind of plays throughout the book. Maybe Maude first, kind of tell us what the kind of seed for the project was. The book is about you looking at your family, kind of taking this trend of people over the last 5-10 years, looking at our family trees and DNA search and all this, and taking that kind of to a different level. Tell us a little bit about that, and maybe we can kind of work our way into that topic.
Sure. Well, first, I really would like to thank Honorée for doing this. I love her novel so much, and it really means so much to me. It really does. And thank you to Magic City too. This is my prior experiences of Tulsa have been going to the Oral Roberts camp meeting many years when I was a child. So this is a much nicer experience of Tulsa. And finally, I would like to just begin by acknowledging that I am on the lands of the Lenape people. And I know that at least one person in the audience tonight is also a Lenape person, and so I just wanted to acknowledge that and extend a welcome or a sort of across the wave sort of recognition of that connectivity. Yeah, so generational trauma, I think that is something that's in the Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois, and it's one of the reasons I found it so poignant. And in my book, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of that. There's trauma that was inflicted in my own family down through the generations, and then there was trauma that was inflicted, on Black people through slavery, my ancestors who enslaved people, on Indigenous people, and I'm only beginning to unearth those histories. So, of course, my first interest in this came from, my childhood and sort of recognizing patterns. And, my father was a real white supremacist and also pretty emotionally abusive. And so yeah, I was just interested in these different patterns that I noticed. And over time, as the idea of epigenetics and the possibility of a sort of transfer through the generations, through the expression of our genes started to be talked about, this idea of intergenerational trauma, that was one of the things that I wanted to explore in the book. I wanted to really look at the science. I knew that a lot of hard scientists were really denying that this happens, and in this sort of way of looking at humans as this exceptional sort of species that doesn't participate in this, in intergenerational epigenetic changes. But I also just wanted to sort of allow myself to think and feel around that after delving into the science. So as you say, Jeff, the book is this sort of mix of very, very, very personal stuff. And also it goes, hopefully in a very approachable way, but deep into science, insofar as I, as a lay person, could understand it. So that's a sort of long answer, but that's my answer.
And so, Honorée, I'm curious, on the flip side of that, we've talked before, of course, about the journey of making Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois, which was quite an undertaking. I'm curious, you personally, what kind of journey have you taken to kind of explore your own family? Have you kind of gone down the same rabbit holes that Maude has in terms of kind of wanting to kind of find out what's under every rock and nook and cranny in your history?
Well, first, as Maude has done, I would like to read the land acknowledgement that I typically always read, that the town that I live in, Norman, was established on land that was the traditional home of the Caddo Nation and Wichita and affiliated tribes. This territory once also served as a hunting ground, trade exchange point, and migration route for the Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, and Osage nations. This land was also promised to the Muskogee Creek and Seminole peoples after their forced removal from the southeastern United States in the 1830s. And as we know, much of this land was stolen, both in the southeastern United States and here in Oklahoma. One of the reasons that's very important to me is because I identify as an Afro-Indigenous person, even though I don't have proof. What we have in our family is family lore. We also have the fact that Eatonton, Georgia, where my mother's people are from, is former Creek land. And right up the road, like about 10 miles, is Rock Eagle, which is and I remember one of the copy editors asked me, was this something I had made up, right, in the book? And I said, no, there actually is a Rock Eagle, right, site, historical site. So I think one of the things that I do, because I am an African-American person that's identified as Afro-Indigenous, but I was reared African-American. So I try to be very respectful, not to intrude, unless I'm, and it's not an intrusion, when I'm invited, which I've slowly been, invited to sort of participate in cultural events. I have friends who are Native American, but I think the difference between Maude's experience and my experience is most African Americans, you hit a wall at 1870. And so that's the first census in the southeastern United States. It's different in New England, parts of New England, and also in Louisiana, which used to be part of, it used to be a French colony. The French kept all kinds of records on enslaved African Americans. But in, Anglo American territories, there were very few records that were kept on Black people, except for when they were sold or when they were executed, different things like that. There are some records, but it's like a miracle, when you find them. And so for me, and this, of course, is as I'm looking back, right? When I first started writing the Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois, I just was trying to get in where I fit in. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know that it was going to be this big book, this kind of series book. I've talked several times frequently about the fact that it was supposed to be a beach read initially, right? And so for me, I think writing love songs was a way of recovering a history in my spirit. I said all that to say that will probably never be recovered in real life. I have tried to find a documentary trail. Again, you hit that wall. You hit the 1850, the 1860 slave schedules. They don't list Black people by name. They just list them by gender and that they're, Negro. My father's people, there's a bit more because they were mixed race, but also my father's great-grandfather fought in the colored Union troops. So the United States colored. What a lot of people don't know is that color didn't just mean Black, it meant Native American, and it also meant Asian. So that's what I have.
Yeah. I'm curious, Maude, when you started out on this project, because it goes in so many different places, I would imagine it changed as you were doing it. But I'm curious, was there kind of a ultimate question you were trying to answer? Was it as simple as who am I, or who are these people? Like, what was the kind of ultimate thesis starting point for that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So from the outset, a lot of people over time, as you might imagine, having read the book, a lot of people would say, oh, you should write a memoir. Yeah. And I would think, oh, I actually can't think of anything I would less like to do than spend, some amount of time just writing about my family and how messed up sort of the experience of my family was in these various ways. But as I started enlarging my sense of family out, so on my mom's side, we had these tall tales of like her father who had married supposedly 13 times. I've found 10 marriages, but I could get to 13 eventually. His father who, supposedly killed a man with a hay hook, which conjures a certain kind of Texan, like, swashbuckling, hothead kind of a person, which is not what I found. I found a much more sort of deep, sympathetic situation. I found that this all happened because he had stood up for a young woman whose stepfather had tried to rape her. And I, having been sexually abused myself when I was a child and having sort of no one really stepped forward in that situation, I was really ashamed of my kind of like, ha ha ha, my notorious ancestor playing cards, kind of approach to this person. On my father's side, I knew that my family had enslaved people. What I did not expect to find was how many people had enslaved people, and it wasn't a situation where, my ancestor was Thomas Jefferson, and so they were enslaving hundreds of people or whatever Jefferson's situation was. It was, this ancestor was enslaving 3 people, and this ancestor was enslaving 20 people, and this ancestor was enslaving 1 person or 5 people. And it was just shocking, to me, to find this, like, so many ancestors who had participated in this, that to this day, I don't know how many people on this land my ancestors enslaved. So I knew that, because my father was such an overt white supremacist and so of the Mississippi Delta, my mom's family is Texan, my father's family, Mississippi Delta, he was like a birds of a feather flock together guy, but to the extent of like covering over Black children in my storybooks, spanking me for watching Sesame Street, like really, really intense stuff, which was horrible. But it forced me to have a relationship to slavery that I think a lot of white people have not been forced to have. So I had to have some kind of relationship to this. It was not possible for me to pretend that it hadn't happened. And he was pro-slavery, literally. He felt that slavery should never have been outlawed. So this was part of my childhood. And so, I knew when I decided to write the book, I knew that the only way I wanted to write it is if it could sort of go through all of the different things that I explore, so that I would keep myself interested, so that it could be sort of sprawling, yet have a direction that was satisfying to me. So, I wrote about genealogy, genetic genealogy, nature, nurture, epigenetics, intergenerational trauma, racism, generational wealth. And then I knew I wanted to go into spirituality and sort of reckon with my ancestors in that kind of way, but I was very afraid and uncertain about what that would entail, because there's a lot of religious extremism in my family. I had reacted by becoming what I would call a fervent agnostic. So, I'm not someone who likes to, unless I'm writing a short essay, I'm happy to write a tidy little thing. But in general, for a bigger project, I like to stay entertained, and the only way that I could stay engaged like this was to constantly surprise myself. And so that, the structure stayed the same over the 7 years that I spent writing the book as a book. But apart from adding a separate section on intergenerational wealth and wills and slavery and all of that. But so that's a very long answer, but it was kind of a long process.
I'm in, just one follow-up to that is I'd like to talk about shame and embarrassment.
Yeah.
And I'm curious how you deal with those two things, if that was a struggle, if you're able to compartmentalize things enough, or do you feel those things? Is this process? Yeah.
I absolutely feel those things. Yeah. I absolutely feel shame and embarrassment. And
it's helping with that. Is this project helping you get through that stuff?
Absolutely. I believe that the truth will set you free. I don't identify as a Christian, but I've taken that lesson to heart from the Bible. And the real didactic point of this book for me, I hope people might read it and find many things to resonate, or at least a few, but the true didactic aim of the book is to encourage other people with family histories like mine to come forward and to acknowledge them, and sure, it's embarrassing and it's very shameful. It's hard to think of anything more shameful. But at the same time, hiding it, feeling a loyalty to protect the people who, did this. Or sometimes I think of it as almost like being like a dog who steps away from a pile of poop after they've pooped. Like they want to kind of like, oh, that wasn't me. My dog like gets as far away from that as she can. Like, oh, look at that. And that's not a way to live, and I do believe that it's individually a weight on a person, whether they realize it or not, to stay silent about these histories. And even leaving aside the sort of potential for personal healing that can come from acknowledging these shameful histories. There's obviously the cultural component of this. And so we see we're arguing, we're finger wagging about, critical race theory, yes, and critical race theory, no. And those are important discussions, but we can have very important discussions if we make it personal. So if I'm saying to you, critical race, blah, 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 that's different from me saying to you, a little more than 150 years ago, my ancestors were enslaving people. And here's how I feel about that. And here's how I see that my privilege is a direct result of that. And people may still be angry, they may still argue, but it's personal. And that's different from a theoretical discussion.
I'd like to turn this over to Honorée and talk about myth for a second, because I was thinking about these two works and the power of myth. Because one work, when you look at Maude's book, is kind of busting myths, you know, the dangerous power of the myths we tell ourselves and try to cope with things. And then Honorée, you kind of have created myths. We were talking about that. You kind of made this world. I think oftentimes we talk about works of science fiction and fantasy in terms of world building, but I think the world that you built with the Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois fits that model too. And you're creating, like you said, in a way, kind of creating your own history because you didn't have access to it. Or so talk about the kind of power, maybe first off, of myth in the work you're trying to do.
Well, before I say that, I want to just kind of piggyback over something that Maude talked about, which I think I was scribbling, you know, I'm a teacher, so I was taking notes. When Maude makes this very brilliant point about shame. And I think that Maude gets this, which is why I just adore her. But a lot of white folks and Black folks too do not get that Black people are involved in the history. I'm not talking about Africans, in the African Americans in the history of slavery, because most of us who were descendant from the transatlantic slave trade are multiracial. And so there's this sort of attitude that we don't have a right to talk about this history because we're Black and Black people are over there. But the fact is that I'm descendant from at least 2 slaveholders. And so that shame is both a shame or would be, although I'm very proud of being descendant from formerly enslaved people. I think that there is, like, I mean, I'm not happy about the pain that they went through, but when I look at how they survived and how I'm still here, that is an extraordinary joy. So I think that that's one of the things that Love Songs tries to interrogate, is the fact that Ailey is descendant from each person, each group that occupies this land. And so she's an inheritor, even though her phenotype and her overwhelming cultural background is African American. She is an inheritor of all 3 of those legacies. And so the issue of the myth is both overt, but also, even though I'm making this up, everything that I write, with very few exceptions, is historically possible. And so that's what I wanted people to read, this sort of grand sweeping. I mean, after I gave up the fact that I wasn't writing a beach read, right? That I wanted people to read this sort of grand sweeping family saga, but I also wanted them to see every detail that you see is historically possible. There were Black people who were adopted into Native American tribes in Georgia, but also who were enslaved. And so there's a reference to that. There were white men who were mated with Native American women. That took place in Georgia. There was I was shocked that so many people did not know about the Georgia land lottery. and how that land was distributed, stolen from the Chalagi, the Muskogee Creek people, and other tribes. The Seminole were once a part of the Creek people, how that land was stolen and then reapportioned. I think that, for me, like, a lot of people know about slavery, but they don't know Native American history. They have this sort of fetishizing, and which I find deeply distressful and offensive. And also, they're not aware that Native Americans are thriving throughout the United States, right? They have not disappeared. They are right here. So in terms of myth, one of the things that I guess I have to wait on an industrious graduate student who might be interested is there's all sorts of Native American folklore that I incorporate throughout the book. There's also African folklore that I keep going back and forth. Is this a spoiler? But I'm gonna go on ahead and say it. Joe is a god. And people, I mean, I figured people would get that when Joe is there in the early to mid 18th century, and then Joe is there in the mid 19th century. Like, I'm like, but I've had so many people, what happened to Joe? I'm like, Joe's a god, right? Joe is not like a person, right? So, but Joe is actually an intersection between, he's an Afro-Indigenous character. So on the one hand, Joe is one of the little people, which is, folklore that shows up in different Native American cultures throughout the United States, not just Southeastern. But then Joe is also an African Orisha. He is Eshu-Elegbara. So what I wanted to do is to show how, for example, people, I'm a Christian, but I always say I'm a pro LGBTQ. I say gay all the time. Gay, right? I'm a pro LGBTQ Christian and a radical feminist. And I always say that's like jumbo shrimp. That's like an olive. There are like maybe, 10 of us. But I'm also someone who recognizes that in the same way that I acknowledge the sort of lore within the Bible as potentially true, I do the same with Native American lore. I do the same with African lore. And so all of that is connected. Mm. Because when people live among each other, even if they don't mate, you can't live like this for, Oglethorpe touched down in Georgia in 1733, but there was a European presence in Georgia well before that. There were traders going through and out. So you cannot have people doing this without cultural borrowing or love. I mean, even though people want to say when white men had children by Black women, well, it was a love affair. Well, technically, even if it was a love affair, it's still rape because you can't consent when you're enslaved. So we really can't know whether it was love or not. But that's what I have about myth.
Yeah.
Maude,
I was curious when you were writing the book. I love any book or film or anything that really shows the process of something. And even sometimes when it's a very heavy topic, obviously you deal with some very serious, heavy topics here. I was kind of thinking about that movie Spotlight. And you remember that movie, that film, which deals with, child abuse in the Catholic Church in Boston. But the movie has like this crackling pace to it that almost like All the President's Men or something. They're like solving this problem. They're kind of doing this case. So you kind of forget the weightiness of the underlying topic. This book in many ways felt the same. I was kind of nervous at the start that it was going to be just a lot to take on. Not solely for the fact that I'm a white guy from Oklahoma who God knows how much of this stuff happened in my family too. But the kind of fervor of it that you bring to it, I can tell that you are kind of uniquely suited to this work, and that even though it's very difficult, you kind of jumped at the task of the research and getting all that. It seemed like it sparked something in you. Speak to that a little bit, if that's the case, or maybe I'm way off base. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just not someone who enjoys doing something if I'm not gonna really go there, and if I find that I'm holding back, then I feel compelled to figure out how to stop doing that. And it was also really important to me to, not to shield the reader from these histories at all, but at the same time to try to make it as readable as possible. I mean, not everybody's going to be up for the deep dive into DNA and the privacy issues, or the various things I go into. Hopefully people will be on board for that, but I don't mind if people skip some of that. Getting the tone consistent across the deeply personal stuff and the more sort of philosophical, scientific, historical stuff, that was hard. But yeah, I mean, fervor is the right word. I come by it honestly. My mother started a church in our living room when I was a kid, and that was like she took me to the Oral Roberts camp meeting for a reason.
We're gonna have to have a whole separate call.
A whole conversation. I want to know about that.
If you do, but yeah, she would cast out demons, and so when I was so for most of my life I've been very afraid that I too would one day start a church in my living room, and it's because her conversion was, as I often say, swift and feverish. Yeah, so
that's the next book.
Swift and Feverish is a great title.
Good to know. Thank you. Yeah, but she, so I come by it honestly, like there is a real sort of engagement, and I wanted to do the best I could to transmit that to the page.
Yeah, a couple follow-ups to that. I'm curious, just in the world where we're living in, and I'm sure you had conversations about this with your editor and everyone else. How do you, and I think you did such a great job with this. I'm kind of giving you a compliment through the back door here, but the book is not prescriptive, which I thought could easily be, and kind of telling people, this is very much just a portrait of your family. It doesn't come off feeling like anyone could do what you did, or feels like exactly the same thing. But I also wonder about, just kind of the potential pitfall of virtue signaling.
Oh, sure.
And how much of that you thought about, and how many conversations you had. I'm sure it was constantly on your mind, right?
I think about it all the time. And that was one reason that it was really important to me to just really go as deep into myself as I could, and really try to transmit that to the page. And one thing that I think there are a lot of legitimate critiques about virtue signaling. And if anyone has any to bring to me about my book, I am open to that. I don't, in order to write the book, I had to, resign myself to the fact that I wasn't going to get everything right. So, if people have some way that I could have handled something better, I am ready to hear that. But at the same time, something that's really come to me on this discussion with virtue signaling is that it's often, I'm sorry to use this word in this way, but weaponized by people who are more conservative and who are resistant to acknowledging difficult things. And so one thing that's really come to the fore for me is just sort of like, this could even be more insufferable virtue signaling depending on your perspective, but really thinking about my young child self, and the ways in which that person was dismayed by these histories and really sort of felt this instinctive compassion for suffering and this willingness to engage, this willingness to ask questions that were not filtered through, a whole lifetime of people criticizing and a whole lifetime, just this pure sort of like compassion, willingness to be open, and curiosity and concern. And so, I tried to bring that to this project to sort of like honor that part of myself that I think over the course of my adult life has been, even within myself, I've ridiculed that little person at times. But that's kind of, yeah, I know that's kind of a weird answer, but that's the truth of how I dealt with it.
I'd like to connect with what Maude is saying. Many people have asked me, why do you write about slavery? Many people have called my work terrifying. Yeah, terrifying. Or they'll, and I know they don't mean any harm on Instagram. They'll have like this much trigger warning, and they're like, this, and I'm like, American history is violent and brutal. I'm sorry you're triggered. This is our history, right? Even when you think about it, it took me a really long time to understand just how vicious and violent tarring and feathering somebody was. Because when I was in elementary school, they would just be talking about it like, no big deal. And you're like, wow, that's not cute. So, but it's the same when you talk about your child self. I'm always careful because I don't want anyone to conflate me with my characters. But as someone who grew up in a very, very difficult household, and I'm not comparing myself to an enslaved person, but when I would read what Dr. Henry Louis Gates would later call the classic slave narratives, I felt this kinship with Frederick Douglass, with Harriet Jacobs, with, these people that I would read about. And the fact that I couldn't leave my house. And, I was trapped, and that they had run away. They had escaped that. It was a compassion, as Maude has talked about. It was a deep sense of connectivity, of compassion, of love that I had, that I never let go of, that I kept. Even through my hot mess 20s and hot mess 30s. But now, being the hopefully better, although I've still got, some issues I want to work through, because I do believe in heaven. So I don't want St. Peter calling security on me, when I get, but what Maude said just instantly I connected with, because there is, and I think when people talk about virtue signaling, it's because other people don't want to do their work, and because that work is hard. What Maude has done is hard. And a lot of people don't want to do the work. So then what they're going to do is they're going to talk crap about people who are doing the work, because once you start doing that deep dive, you know, and I've been in, not my family's archives, but I've been in historical archives since 1990, and it is painful. It is incredibly painful. And a lot of people don't want to do that work. And so that's why they're like, oh, you just want to say you're a great person. You just want to look down on the rest of us. And that's not what it is. What it is that some of us are called to do this work. We just are. I hate to, you know, get all, you know, biblical on folks, but, you know, some of us are called to do the work. So that we can try to hold up a mirror to American society, but also that we love this society enough to talk about what is wrong with it. Love does not mean when you throw your dirty drawers on the floor that I'm gonna say, wow, your drawers smell like lavender. What a beautiful sight, these dirty drawers on the floor, right? I'm going to say, hey, you know, that's not cool. And that's what, you know, love is, you know, working it out. It's not simply ignoring. But I think that's what, and it's not just white folks, Black folks too. Some Black folks, you start talking about Africa, ooh, they get mad. They get mad. They say that you are, you know, race traitor or whatever. Then white folks think you're saying, oh, it's great, that it's totally fine that we, you know, ratcheted up that slave trade even further and made it even more brutal, because look at West African participation. So it, you know, you can't win either side. But when you love the country and you know you're going to stay here, you're just trying to make it a better place.
We have about 10 minutes left. I want to tell folks to get those questions in. If you have some, we'd like to get through some of those. We've talked about a lot of stuff, so there's so many areas we could go to. I'm sorry we don't have more time, but
there's one question you want to ask it, Jeff, in the chat, in the Q&A.
Yeah, this is a good one for, obviously for you. It says, where did the title of your book come from? Why is the book called The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois?
Well, W.E.B. Du Bois is the greatest African-American intellectual, bar none, of both the 19th and the 20th centuries. He was born in 1868. He died the day before the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. They announced his death at the march. But I would say he is the greatest American intellectual of any cultural background of the 19th and 20th century, if we're looking at making America better. And so I went to a historically Black college, Talladega College, and one of the things that I noticed is that you could not take, if you took a history class, if you took social work, sociology, English, political science, I am reading the critical race reader just so I can explain to very stupid people that critical race theory is not the same as teaching kindergartners about Black history. It's very dense and but he is mentioned, and it's a legal framework, and he is mentioned in many of these legal essays, these legal articles. And so you just couldn't get past him. I first read The Souls of Black Folk when I was maybe 12, 13, 14, something like that. I was a very young person. I was a very avid reader. And it's the work that has stuck with me because it's so lyrical. And it does what I call the crossroads essay, where he takes his personal life, and then he intersects it with what's going on in America writ large. And that's what I've done with my work, even as a poet from the very beginning. The one thing about him is he always had a good word for Black folks. He always was, even when he was angry and even when he was hopeless, he was still doing the work for Black people in America. And so that's the sort of intellectual framework. And the way that he ended up in the book is that Uncle Root, who just, I'm kind of shocked everybody just loves Uncle Root, but Uncle Root was just supposed to be a walk-on character. He was not supposed to be throughout the book. And he would tell the story about how he met the great W.E.B. Du Bois. And when I started revising the book, you know, I think I maybe had about 11, 12 revisions, right? Before it was sold. That was when it was only 450 pages. Now it's 790 pages. I decided to expand Uncle Root's character. And one of the readers that was looking at the book was like, why don't we, I would love to hear this story again. And so he becomes this sort of member of Ailey's family, even though, you know, he's not. And because he's Black America. So that's, and you know, some people were like, that's a stupid title. There were a couple of people that were like, that's a stupid title. And I was like, I love the title.
I think it's going to go down as like one of the great titles. You know what's a stupid title? Like The Shawshank Redemption. But guess what? You know, it's just, my point is that the quality of the work defines the title. Like that title is your title is going to be known for ages. We're running out of time, but I want to ask Maude a question, which is, now that the book is out, and you know, it's been a long time coming. I'm sure it feels good to kind of get it out in the world, or probably nerve-wracking, or both. How do you kind of gauge the success of the book? I'm not talking about book sales or anything like that. I'm just curious, like once you've finished it and you put it out there, how do you know if it works, does what you want it to do? What's your gauge on that?
Yeah, I mean, I will admit that I care more about, you know, I'm more attached to the outcome than I had hoped that I would be. You know, when I was writing it, I was very able to sort of just be like, I am doing what I need to do. I was surprised to find myself, this could really sound gross, like virtue signaling, but I was really trying to write it in a spirit of service. And yeah, but, you know, ultimately I do feel able to just sort of think like the book will make its own little way in the world. And, you know, there was a point when I was writing, you know, finishing it up a couple years ago, and, you know, the last administration was in office, and I recognize that we're still not in a good situation, but that was just, I was like, well, you know, if we are going to go into an authoritarian state, and books are going to be banned, or, you know, whatever terrible future I might imagine, I was like, I would like to write a book that people can have in their homes, to sort of like, you know, to help them maybe find a little bit more meaning in their lives in some way, you know, which is both grandiose and a little crazy, but you know, that was kind of my aspiration. So
I think that speaks to what we were talking about, you know, people being called to do certain work. I think that's important. I think sometimes we feel nervous about stating that ambition, or that we feel a certain thing like that. But if you feel it, and that, you know, I think that's great. I think that's it's a noble effort, you know.
It'll make its own way. I just want to show everyone the beautiful cover that Rachel Ake made, because I'm really
beautiful cover.
Really gorgeous. That's a really beautiful.
Both of these books, which I should mention, we were running out of time here. We're doing a special today.
Honorée was one I sent as like, I like this cover, you know.
I mean, yeah, that orange, it's like a sun, you know, it's like beautiful.
And you know what? I had absolutely no input in that cover. And when I saw it, I was like, it's the tree. It's the pecan tree, because that's what I say, pecan. It's the pecan tree. It's Uncle Root's tree. It was a whole thing. And orange is my favorite color. And yes, so, and I felt the same way. I felt like, I mean, once Miss Oprah picked the book, then I felt like I was representing her. And so a lot of the work that I've done, Maude and I talk, you know, behind the scenes sometimes, and a lot of the exhaustion that I feel, but I did this because she put her name behind me. And I wanted to show her that, you know, that meant a lot. I think if her name hadn't been associated with it, I probably would have wrapped up this book, this book tour in December. But yeah, I thought the same when you know, because we sold the book to Harper. My agent sold the book when the former president was in office, and when 2017 happened and the men with the tiki torches showed up in Virginia, there was a thing that I understood, that this was not, I wasn't writing about history anymore. I was writing about life, like a continuum. And that's when I was like, oh wow. And I feel that same way about Maude's book. I mean, you know, I just love Maude's book. I just love it. I feel like it's incredibly important because as someone who is considered a scholar, it's one thing when you have white scholars who do this kind of work where they're only speaking to other scholars. What Maude is doing is translating this history to a larger audience. And it is both beautifully written, but also very accessible at the same time. And a lot of times you don't get that. A lot of times you don't get beauty and accessibility, you know. And so I think Maude's book is going to be taught. I think, and I'm not just saying that, you know, I'm pretty blunt. I wouldn't say it if I didn't, you know. Yeah, I think it's.
I'd like to squeeze in one more question here before we wrap up. And this is a question for both of you from Latria Graham here, who says,
Latria Graham! Hey!
Yeah. And it's a two-part question. One is, how do you tend to yourselves when you're doing these personal investigations? So kind of self-care question, but also a question of what advice do you have for people preparing to enter archives and do their own deep dives into their own history, census records, the history of the country? Is there any, having done a lot of this, what could you tell people about getting ready to do something like this endeavor?
Yeah, I love Latria's work, and I'm so excited, beyond excited for her book.
Too.
And yeah.
I love an arc, Latria. Going ahead, Maude.
You know, that's a really, really good question. And I feel so conscious of everything that Latria is taking on in her own work with her family and land, and all, you know, the wonderful things that she's exploring. And yeah, I would just say pace yourself, you know, be as patient with yourself and the process of discovery as you can. And, you know, I know that all three of us are on the same page about paying attention to seemingly random signs. I really believe in that for a writer. And I think Honorée has written so many books that I really should turn it over to her.
Oh, well, one thing that I do, and I'll make this quick because we're right at the hour. I'm an unabashed God lover. I pray. I try very hard to just stay grounded spiritually. I think that understanding that you're going to encounter some things that are painful. And so now I've started doing a daily yoga practice, because it will sort of set up camp in your body. And I think a lot of people don't really get that. So I think the other thing is be prepared, as Maude said, for signs, and be prepared to find something that you were not expecting. And always know that history is made up of living people, and it's not dead. As Faulkner says, the past isn't dead, it isn't even past. And so understand that when you're seeing the life of someone, you're seeing a piece of history, and honor them by trying to be as truthful as you can to that life.
I want to tell everyone, you guys got to read Ancestor Trouble. You got to pick up a copy of the Love Song of W.E.B. Du Bois. It's quite the dynamic duo of a read, and you're going to remember these journeys. These are going to be books that you want to spend time with and revisit over the years. Thank you to our good friend, the Honorable HFJ Honorée Fanonne Jeffers, and our new friend, Maude Newton. This was a truly great hour of talk, and thank you so much. We've recorded this. It'll be on our YouTube page if anybody missed it or would like to forward it on. And also anyone who registered, you'll get an email of this recording as well if you'd like to watch it again or send it on to some folks, and tell everyone that you had the great pleasure of seeing these two wonderful authors give this talk. So thank you both. Thank you all for watching. Take care, keep reading, and we'll see you all very, very soon. Good night.
Good night.